Hello, Living Water family. Good to talk to you again. It's been a while since I've had a chance to share things with you, but I wanted to share with you some things that just the Lord showed me in my quiet time this morning. So I want to read a couple of passages out of the New Testament because I want to talk about three men this morning real quickly. So this is a passage out of John chapter 13. It was just before the Passover feast, and Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. And the evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. And Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Skipping down a little further, in verse 21, it says, After he had said these things, Jesus' spirit was troubled, and he testified, I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples stared at one another and at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciples whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to the disciple and said, Ask him which one he means. Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, Lord, who is it? And Jesus answered, It is the one to whom I give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, son of Simon. As soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. And Jesus said, What you are about to do, do quickly. A little later in the evening, when they were talking, Jesus said, A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. And Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus replied, Where I am going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. And Peter said, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. And then Jesus answered, Will you really lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And then out of the book of Mark, this is in chapter 15, starting in verse 1, it says, Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin reached a decision, and they bound Jesus and led him away and handed him over to Pilate. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, Aren't you going to answer? See how many things you are being accused of? But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the feast to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release to you the King of Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of envy that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests had stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then with the one you called the King of the Jews? Pilate asked. Crucify him, he shouted. Why, what crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, Crucify him. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. As I was reading this morning, it struck me that here are 3 men who in some ways represent us in this world right now. And it struck me that here is Judas, who's already in his heart committed to betraying Jesus. And Jesus loved him enough to wash his feet, humbly wash his feet anyway. And as I'm thinking about Judas, here's a man who had walked with Jesus for nearly 3 years as his disciple, learning from him, watching him, just even ministering alongside of him for these 3 years. The things that he saw must have been amazing. And yet in the end, he had betrayal in his heart. and he allowed the enemy to get in. And that just saddens me, because I think that we have to look at that in ourselves. Where are we in that? You know, are we the ones who will in the end betray the Lord? And then here's Barabbas. Barabbas, we know, is a murderer. It's said that he led insurrection, and yet his life was spared, and Jesus, who was not guilty of anything, was forfeited instead and was crucified. And that reminds me that we didn't do anything to deserve that sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross for us. We were guilty. We should have been crucified. We should have paid that penalty. And yet here is Christ, who paid the penalty for all. And it makes me wonder how many people in this world that price has been paid for them, and they don't know it, and they don't take advantage of it. So brothers and sisters, I'm encouraging you to take advantage of that and pursue Christ with all you have. Let's look at Peter. Here's Peter, who was devoted to Jesus, who followed Jesus from the start, one of the first disciples, always a part of the big three, the ones that Jesus favored the most, who were his special disciples. Peter, loudmouth, outspoken, boisterous, sometimes inappropriate, but passionately loved the Lord. And with all of his heart, he says, yes, I will lay down my life for you. And Jesus says, no, before the end of the night, you will have denied me 3 times before the rooster crows. I got to imagine that Peter was like, what? No, I would never do that, Lord. I love you. I would never do that. I will go with you to whatever end you have. And yet, a few hours later, he did exactly that, and he turned his back and denied the Lord. I've never been in a life-threatening situation like that. I can't imagine what Peter was going through that would cause him to deny his Lord. But I can only imagine that we are all capable of doing so. I can only imagine that it would be heartrending for us to realize that we're capable of turning our back on the Lord. And yet at the same time, he was redeemed by the Lord. In the end, Peter came back around and took up his cross with the Lord. And the Lord reunified with him and brought him back into the fold and built him back up and sent him off to lead the disciples. In the end, Peter, we know that from history, we know that Peter was martyred. And so he did give his life for the Lord in the end. And I would like to think that even though that there are times when we might turn our back on the Lord, I hope that we would all be able to stand firm in our faith and not deny him. Until we get into that point, I just don't know that we can know that. The one thing I do know is that continual pursuit of my relationship with the Lord is what keeps me from denying him. Gives me the courage to stand in the face of contention and opposition, and to take that stand for the Lord. But without that, without spending the time with the Lord, without being strengthened by him, without being taught by him, I don't know that I would be able to do so. And that's not just on a Sunday. I can't get what I need just on Sunday. I have to be in relationship with the Lord every day, reading my Bible every day, strengthening myself in the Lord, so that at some point, if and when I have to face that kind of thing, I will respond like Peter did, not like Judas, not like Barabbas. Judas had his own agenda, and he walked with the Lord for a long time, but he had his own agenda, and he wouldn't surrender his agenda for the Lord. And in the end, he betrayed the Lord. Barabbas didn't know the Lord. He didn't know Jesus. Jesus paid the price for that man, and yet he never knew the Lord. And maybe in the end, Barabbas was convicted and became a believer. We don't know. There's nothing in history that tells us that. But I know that Peter was able to get through this failure We all fail. We all make mistakes. We all are going to let the Lord down at times. But like Peter, we need to pick ourselves back up and continue with the mission that our Lord has given us. We were talking about this passage in our Bible study the other night, and it struck us that here is John, who was confident enough in the Lord's love for him that he described himself as the disciple that the Lord loved. I want us to all be in that place where we can describe ourselves as the disciple that the Lord loves. Bless you all. Take care of yourselves.